Firstly, I'll talk about time management. In my preliminary task, I didn't plan my time very well, and the deadlines for each piece of work were not set strict enough, therefore causing me to fall off track and miss the final deadline by about a week. Knowing this information from the previous task, I have made my deadlines more strict and also allowed time realistic. For example, I wouldn't set myself 2 days to get all my photos done. This time I set myself about 2 weeks to get the exact pictures that I wanted, and to make sure that the end product was as good as it could possibly be. Therefore I set a tighter deadline, and stuff that could be done more easily, I made sure all the time I set were realistic and not going to stretch me too hard and cause me to rush the end product. Next, I'm going to talk about the magazine layouts of different genres. Going into my preliminary task, I didn't know the magazine industry hugely well and wasn't aware of all the different layouts and how the layouts of the magazine can define the genre it is presenting. In this task, I just laid out my magazine in the way I thought looked best and didn't consider how it would be laid out if a professional company were to produce it. As I started my in-depth research for my primary task, I realised a huge variety in layouts from genre to genre. This meant that I had to see what sort of layout I was going to go for. Seeing as I was targeting the house market and there were only a few house magazines out there in the current market at the moment, it seemed to be more of a minimalist feel, and there were more classy magazines than competitors in the rock genre, which tend to have more crowded layouts which reflect the music well. When making my magazine, I chose to go with a minimal look and make sure I got the right balance and not making the magazine plain, but making sure I don't overcrowd the pages and make them look like they belong in the rock genre. Thirdly, I will move on to image editing. When I started the preliminary task, I had limited time on Photoshop and I only had about 2 hours worth of experience. Before I started making the preliminary task, this means that I wasn't very good at image editing and wasn't able to manipulate the pictures how I wanted them to look easily. After gaining more experience on Photoshop, I started to know what all the features meant and was able to create a lot better final images in my final piece, such as the blurring of the background on my front cover being crisp and the film strip effect on my double page spread. This extra experience made my main task images a lot better and more professional. Now on to cover line density. When I started my preliminary task, I looked at a few school magazines but didn't look outside the school magazine genre, so had no idea of different cover line densities. After starting my research for my main task, I realised that the different genres of magazines I was looking at had different cover line densities, such as the rock magazine having lots of cover lines to fill the page for a more messy look to represent the genre, and some more classy R&B magazines going for the more minimalist feel and having less cover lines, making the magazine look more minimal. They have chosen their cover line densities to represent their style of music to attract their audiences. After considering this in my main task, I decided to go somewhere in the middle, as I felt my magazine was between R&B and rock. This creative decision was made through what I had learned after researching for my main task. Written content. For my preliminary task, I didn't have to write a double page spread, although I still had to construct the writing in my contents page and also the cover lines. Due to minimum research, I didn't understand how magazines word the writing in their magazines, and I wrote my preliminary task from a first-person standpoint and how I thought the wording should be constructed. After my research for my main task, I realised that the music magazine industry was a lot more informal, from cover lines to double page spreads. Swearing and slangs was used a lot to create a less formal magazine and stay away from the more formal genres of magazines such as school magazines. Although I shouldn't have written my preliminary task in this way, I made the mistake of using listing in my contents page and didn't have any descriptions of the pages in my contents, which is the way a lot of magazines have now. Drafting. In my preliminary task, I didn't draft my work and just constructed it from scratch, and meant that I made my creative decisions as I was going along. After finding out that my preliminary task didn't turn out as well as I thought it would, I decided that when I made my main task, I would draft a lot more thoroughly and make sure that I knew all my creative decisions before I started making it and had a clear idea of what I wanted it to look like. I started with paper drafts and moved on to Photoshop drafts, and then improving through feedback and my own decisions. This made my end product a lot better and a lot more professional. Finally, colour schemes. Going into my preliminary task, the first idea that came into my head was to use the school badge colour scheme, and I thought it worked fairly well, although there would be a few things that I would change. Although I thought it worked well, it may have been too bright, and more subtle colours will probably have worked better. After looking at music magazines, which are meant to be more wacky and eccentric, they still weren't as bright as my school magazine, and this is something that I would change. Knowing this, I made sure that I knew the music magazine market well in terms of colour schemes for my main task, and made sure I went for something more simple but effective, such as blacks, whites and reds.